Hi, folks. Welcome to Class 6 of Public Administration Theory. And building on some of the previous ideas we talked earlier, this class will focus on accountability. How does the idea of accountability play into public enterprises? How do public administrators see their own accountability? And more generally, what is the notion of accountability in public administration? And related to this, we'll examine one tension, which is how do we reconcile the need for greater autonomy of individuals, since we're talking about democracy and these ideas, with those of greater accountability. And I'll also use some examples from the world of nonprofits because they are somewhat similar. The ideas of accountability in the nonprofit sector and public administration are seem to overlap quite a bit. So let's look at the history of this idea a little bit. So the idea of accountability really came from the idea of liberty and fraternity, equality. Basically the classical liberal ideas, which came from the Renaissance era and after that. So the idea essentially was to um, uh, figure out how to make the state accountable to its people, because earlier, if you remember, it was the king who was all powerful, so he was pretty much accountable to himself, and no one else. So you couldn't really pull up a king if he was very despotic or cruel. Only way to get rid of him was to have another king who would replace him, right? So, whereas with more ideas of equality and some sort of a democracy after the Renaissance era, people started thinking about, okay, what does a healthy state look like? How should power be distributed? And what is the responsibility of the state? By state, I mean the nation state, to its people. So that phase lasted for quite a while. You could say from say mid 16th 17th century till about 1980s, where various models of welfare state existed. Basically, welfare states were quite dominant in Europe, Western Europe primarily. And if you look at contemporary Germany, France, Spain, these are classical welfare states. Even the UK, to quite an extent. Uh, then the model shifted to what we call the new public management, which you've heard and read about now, where the idea was to subcontract out or privatize many of the welfare services to nonprofits and other private players. So the government actually became less powerful. And again, this started with the Reagan era, 1980s, coinciding with similar movements in UK, for instance, with Margaret Thatcher and others. So the idea there is again shifting of responsibility, pretty much from government being the provider of services to one of being an overseer or manager of these services. And other scholars have called the idea of this being, instead of steering, David Osborne, for instance, he has argued that the idea of the government being the steerer, as in a boat steering away, to one of being sort of a rower and just managing the process. So that's the shift in change. So here is a definition of accountability, which I think it could be useful. So it's defined as a social relationship where an actor is obliged to explain or justify his actions in some way. So that's taken in a very public administration context. So think of what this means, and what does social relationship in this context mean, and what does it imply, right? Okay, again, this is the classical origins of the word. So apparently, in the 11th century, William I, who was king, I believe, of England, he conquered England in was 1085 and required all the subjects to give account of their possessions. So basically, giving an account. So that's where the term comes from. So of course, this has taken multiple meanings since that era, but this is an interesting historical fact that could be interesting. One of the articles that talks about accountability is by Bovens, where he breaks down the idea of accountability into these four aspects, right? And he talks about accountability is responsibility of the government as responsibility to act. It is also as responsibility as accountability, responsibility as liability, and responsibility as virtue, right? So it's basically capturing the essence of how public managers are supposed to act and how they're supposed to behave in their uh, work towards the public, and who is their responsibility towards, and what are the implications, what are the facets of this responsibility, right? Um, so, as we talked about a little earlier, accountability is seen as a part of the good governance model. It's something that is often mentioned in the same breath when people talk about good governance, and is often linked to related ideas of transparency, democracy, efficiency, responsiveness, responsibility, and integrity. Right. So those are some of the key ideas that are associated with the study of accountability in public administration. So, in the federal government, there is the Government Accountability Office, which is the federal agency that oversees the work of government spending primarily and gives recommendations to the various agencies of the federal government. So, I'd like you to watch this short video, which gives you a pretty good history of the GAO, which is headquartered in Washington, D.C. Uh, Again, one of the readings talks about how accountability changed. Now, for our purposes, we also consider post Reagan era. We can look at Bill Clinton's era, where he was also a pretty big reformer of, I mean, advocate of welfare reform, meaning that he wanted to get rid of social, not rid of, but bring more efficiency in terms of how food stamps are distributed and things of that kind. And again, he was also critic of how money was spent by the federal government. So he had almost bought into the whole rhetoric of less government spending. And of course, he also made a lot of important decisions which continue to impact American society today. Now, the problem I think that a lot of these thinkers have tried to achieve or address is the focus on reducing costs, the focus on making sure that there is less fraud, abuse, and waste in government spending. And this, of course, is a perennial problem. It will not go away completely, but there have been major efforts made, a lot of steps by GAO and others to change metrics, to carry out longer studies, to have better streamlined processes, to have different kinds of budgets, instead of just line item budgets. So there is a concept called performance budgeting, where you actually create a budget based on how a certain program does. So there are innovative practices that have been advocated and in some cases practiced. So this is one of the national performance reviews that happened, that Bill Clinton commissioned around that time to bring about greater efficiencies. So these are some of the recommendations that were put forth. One is to cut red tape, to put customers first, empower employees to get better results, and to produce better government for less. So we can think of how these might be seen by people and how these might impact government performance. Another interesting short video on GAO's role in keeping government in check. Uh, Hopefully, this will give you some insight on how the government keeps an eye on its own spending. So, this is an arm of the government, but is independent and sort of oversees the various agencies of the government. So, speaking of the performance measures in the federal budgeting process, because if you look at what is the main measure of accountability, in many cases it's money, right? So how is money spent? Because it is tax dollars, and this is public money that's used for public use. So there is a focus on inputs and outputs usually, and the whole way of measuring effectiveness in the public sector is different from that in the private sector, meaning that the kinds of results you're looking for, even the time period that you're looking for results, could be very different. For instance, for-profit companies operate on a quarterly basis, whereas public agencies operate on a yearly basis. So, and also you cannot change, you cannot noticeably change people's lives within 1 year. In most cases, you need long-term. For instance, think of education. 1 year of education at the undergrad level is not going to bring about a huge impact, right, in a person's life. You need at least a bachelor's degree, so that's 4 years of education. So that's a simple example I took. If you want to measure a certain change, if the federal government is funding a certain program, so how do you measure change? Or what period do you measure change? So that's something to be kept in mind. As I said, the last point is, you're looking at the performance-based budgeting instead of traditional line item budget. That's a creative measure to say, okay, let's fund programs that are doing better instead of just allocating random numbers to programs that have probably not done well in the past. And the second to last point is also very important, meaning that in the case of government, there are lots of stakeholders. There are more stakeholders than in a private company. In private companies, there's usually just the client and the producer of goods or services. Whereas in a public setting, there's more. There's legislators, there's non-governmental organizations, the community groups, the elected officials, and all kinds of people who have to be satisfied and who have to contribute to success of certain programs. So Denhardt and Denhardt talk about this case of Phoenix as being a sort of a very interesting city to study. So what can other cities do to replicate the success of Phoenix? That's something I would like you to think about as you move forward, especially when it comes to accountability, use of technology, use of consensus building, trust building, etc. Another short video by the GAO. Hopefully, this should also be helpful. So I want to share the example of Chattanooga, which is a city in Tennessee, where I actually spent some time doing some research, looking at how the government there has become very proactive in terms of building an information technology hub, and what that means for the people of Chattanooga, and how the whole mechanism of accountability in terms of housing and other policies has come together. So I came across this article which I thought you might enjoy. So I hope you're able to read this. So with that, I hope I've summarized some of the key points you need to pay attention to once you do the readings as well. And I look forward to discussing these ideas with you online. Thank you.